morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio, the podcast where we talk with writers about their lives, their craft, their business, and their latest work. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and our podcast is sponsored by Bookmarks. Bookmarks is a literary nonprofit whose programs include the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas. Come visit Bookmarks at our community gathering space and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Inside the Writer's Studio is also proud to be an affiliate of Libro FM, the audiobook platform that supports your local independent bookstore. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for more information on Libro FM and a special offer. My guest today is Nina Simon, who recently attended the Bookmarks Movable Feast to talk about her debut novel, Mother-Daughter Murder Night. Nina, welcome to Inside the Writer's Studio.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So when I heard you were coming to the Bookmarks Movable Feast, I knew I wanted to interview you. I'd heard about this book. I thought it sounded great. But then you sat down at our table and you told us the story of how and why you wrote this book, to which I responded so powerfully. Tell us a little bit about how this book came to be.
Yeah, so Mother-Daughter Murder Night is my first novel, but about my fifth career. I never expected to write a novel. I always have loved reading. I've always loved writing, but that had always been nonfiction or related to my work working in museums. And then 3.5 years ago, something happened that changed everything for me. My mom got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, with lung and brain cancer. And it was just one of those wake-up call moments where suddenly I didn't want to run the nonprofit that I was the CEO of. All I wanted to do was be with my mom. And I worked things out with the organization I was running and with my husband and kids so that I could move back in with my mom in Los Angeles. And we were super lucky to be together during that time, but it was incredibly stressful and scary time. And we desperately needed an escape. We needed a distraction from all the conversations about pills and doctors and had she drank enough of the protein shake. And we found that distraction in murder. My mom is the person who introduced me to murder mysteries when I was a teenager. And when she got sick, I found myself pulling some old favorites of ours off the shelf to read with her again. You know, books by Sue Grafton and Janet Ivanovich and Faye Kellerman. And then one day I just turned to her and I said, what if I tried writing a murder mystery? And what if I made the lead detective someone like you? And that's really where Mother-Daughter Murder Night was born. I never expected this book to be published. I never expected to be having conversations like the one we're having today. I wrote the entire first draft of this book sitting on my mom's bed and only thinking about an audience of one, which was her, and only thinking, how can I make my mom smile? How could I make her laugh? And I would type while she was sleeping. And then when she woke up, I'd sort of slide the laptop over so she could read what I'd written. I'd go make us some food. And then we'd spend the rest of the day talking about these women in this book and talking about this story. And as my mom started getting better, it wasn't that Mother-Daughter Murder Night erased cancer or made it disappear. I wish that were so. But it minimized it, and it allowed us to spend our time together around something that was joyful, a project that was creative and fun, something we chose as opposed to the situation that we had been thrust into.
So tell us a little bit about the premise of the book.
Yeah. So Mother-Daughter Murder Night is a big-hearted mystery. It's about 3 generations of women, a grandma, a single mom, and a teenage girl who work together to solve the murder of a naturalist who washes up on their doorstep in the Monterey Bay in a marine preserve called Elkhorn Slough. And I think about this book as kind of being cross-genre because it's both a murder mystery with these amateur sleuths of 3 generations solving this crime, but it's also a family drama about these 3 women renegotiating their relationship with each other because, the main character, the star of the show is the grandma, Lana Rubicon, who I wrote to be kind of an outrageous superhero version of my mom. First of all, if you're reading this book, I'm contractually obligated to tell you that my mom is much nicer than Lana Rubicon, but she's just as tough, just as funny, just as strong. And I wrote this character who was a tough LA Jewish businesswoman who right in the beginning of the book gets cancer and is forced to move in with her daughter and granddaughter in their little cottage up in the Monterey Bay. By the way, I live in the Monterey Bay. I could never get my mom to leave Los Angeles, but it turns out in fiction, you can just make people do what you want them to do. So I could move this character up. And I really wrote her to be this outrageous version of my mother, so that while my mom was stuck in bed, I was writing this other woman with cancer leaping out of bed to solve this mystery and hopefully to mend the relationships with her daughter and granddaughter along the way.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about openings for a minute because I always think openings are really important in
Mm.
a murder mystery, and I like openings that don't waste any time. And you give us a dead body pretty much in the first sentence. Um, Talk about what you see as like the essential purpose of an opening, and then also how you crafted the particular opening for this book because it does have a little fun surprise in it.
Yeah, I really believe in this idea that the opening of a book is where you're setting a promise and an expectation with the reader. And so as a reader, I'm starting to understand right away what's the tone of this story, what kinds of danger might be in play, and what can I expect as I go forward. And actually, it's interesting you bring up this opening because this opening is a prologue and it was added later.
Mhm.
Because originally this book started right in with chapter one, which is when Lana, the grandmother, gets sick. But I always knew there was a problem with that beginning because even though it's an inciting incident for her that she gets cancer and has to move, it does not read like a murder mystery. It doesn't set up that promise and expectation with the reader. It sets up a promise and expectation that's maybe about family drama, that's maybe about cancer, but not about murder. And so when working with my editor, we decided to add a prologue ahead of it and not to do the kind of prologue you might see in a thriller where it flashes forward with very dramatic action or something like that, but to do something that sets the stage of this marine preserve that introduces you to the mom and the granddaughter characters, who, while they are not the stars of the show, they are equal weight protagonists. And I think that they are also more relatable than Lana. And so, there's this thing about this idea that the first character you meet is often a character who you feel high identification with as a reader. And one thing I heard from beta readers in the early drafts of this book was that people loved reading about Lana, but they did not feel that they were Alana because she's so outrageous. And so by starting the prologue with Beth and Jack, the single mom and the teenager, it created an opportunity for people, for readers to feel like these are my people. And now we are going into this wild world. And then that first line, let me just read it to make sure I'm doing
Yeah,
it correct. Yeah, is Beth knew she couldn't leave for work until she dealt with the dead body on the beach. And that line
great.
just came to me. And of course, what ends up happening, you find out, within a paragraph that the dead body in question is of a sea lion, or a harbor seal. And so you're introduced to this wild world, but also to the idea that there's some cleverness of language, there might be some surprises, and that there's a sweetness to this story because the mother granddaughter bond between Beth and Jack is very sweet, and that's introduced right away. But there's also tension with the grandmother. And the very end of the prologue, one of the fun things you can do with a prologue that don't happen at other times is you can do a little more overt foreshadowing, or a little more mood setting. And so the very end of the prologue is her mother had never visited Elkhorn Slough, and no one had ever been murdered there. But there was a first time for everything.
Yeah.
And so getting to play with that. And the last thing I'll say about the prologue is did a lot of debating with myself about whether the prologue happens in time, right at or right before chapter one or
Mhm.
not. Because another thing you can play with prologues is they can happen further away in time. And according to the timeline I put together, this prologue does happen right before chapter one, but it also has that a little bit of out of time feel
Yeah,
because of
yeah,
the foreshadowing and the nature setting.
yeah. I mean, it definitely. I felt that it didn't particularly matter to me when that happened. I was
Yes.
just learning these things. I love that you mentioned foreshadowing because this is something we talked about a lot in high school.
Mm.
Uh, and I don't think I've talked about it on the show very much.
Huh.
So tell us a little bit um, about how you use foreshadowing and why you think it is particularly important in a book of this sort where there is a mystery to be solved.
Yeah, I think for me, it really comes to the cross-genre problem. We took seriously the fact that, and when I say we, I mean myself, my agent, my editor, that we wanted this to be both a family drama and a murder mystery. But what that meant from a pacing perspective is that if you were writing a straight murder mystery or a thriller, you can just keep driving the action forward, forward, forward. If you're writing a sweet family drama, you can stay in the home and you can stay with the characters in that warmth. But
Mhm.
those are very different paces. And so, one of the things that I felt had to happen for these things to come together was that the family elements had to have high conflict and tension, and the murder mystery elements had to invite some contemplation so that both of them could kind of pace towards each other. And so, that means that in a family situation, the prologue is fundamentally a sweet family scene at the house. And there are a lot of those in the book. It's between the mother and the granddaughter, Beth and Jack. But they're figuring out what to do with this dead animal. So there is this death on the page, and then there is this foreboding menace about the grandma and how she is portrayed in absentia in that prologue. And so I think that I never wanted readers to either feel that this was a schizophrenic novel or that they liked the mystery but wanted to skip the family parts or vice
Yeah.
versa. And
Yeah.
so I think that it meant that things like foreshadowing were more important, as well as one of the things I listened to a great interview with an author who writes thrillers who talked about word choice and just that even in a simple scene, she was always looking for ways to draw attention to violence with her choice of verbs, with her choice of adjectives. Even if they were cooking dinner, you were going to hold longer on the knife. You were going to hold longer on the red of the tomato and this idea that it connects to blood. And so I think similarly, I was looking for ways because I was doing both of these things and because there's also humor in the book. How do you keep rooting it in that mystery element as well?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure in that first scene with the seal, you used the word eviscerated, which if
Yeah.
I can remember that 3 or 4 days after I read the opening of the book, it obviously it had an effect on me. But
Yeah,
um,
even, Charlie, I got somebody came up to me in an event and she said she really liked the book, but that she wanted me to know that there were people online saying not to read the first page because it was gross, because there
oh
is this eviscerated maggots
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
But again, I'm sort of, I feel like as a reader, I want to understand the promise of what could happen in
yeah,
this world. And so that was very intentional on my part.
yeah. So there are two mother-daughter relationships in this book. There's Beth and Lana, the Lana being the grandmother, and then there's Beth and Jack, Jack being the I think 15-year-old daughter, and Beth is the dad has been gone, since forever. Um, Talk about the contrast between those two relationships and how that contrast provides you with opportunities as a writer.
Yeah. So I really wanted to write a story with three strong female protagonists
Mm.
who are strong in different ways. And I think one of the things the book is exploring is what does it mean to be a strong woman? And each of these three women has a very different answer to that. Lana, who is the grandmother, and their answers are both rooted in their personality, but also their positionality in terms of age, in terms of race. Lana, who is in her late 50s, absolutely believes that strength is about um, getting yours in a man's world, and that there are a lot of things a woman needs to do that, and that it's about some of the classic, more masculine ideas about power and control and independence at all costs. Whereas Beth, her daughter, really defines her strength through interdependence and through caregiving. And yes, she herself is very independent. She left home as a teenage, she was pregnant and on her own, and she made a life for herself. But the life she made for herself really is identified around having a close relationship with her daughter, a close relationship with nature, and a close relationship with the patient she cares for at an assisted living facility. And then Jack, the teenager, first of all, is biracial. She's white and Filipino, and that plays into some of her how she moves through the world and how others see her. But she really has grown up in this wild and natural environment. So for her, her strength comes from being outdoorsy, being adventurous, and wanting always to explore. And so I think what I was interested in was this question of how do you write a group of strong women where the goal is not for one of them to emerge as the victor and the others are followers, but instead they're negotiating how to be strong in different ways together. And to be very transparent, this is 100% how my family works. When my mom got sick, my mom was a single mom. I have one sister who's only a year younger than me. And when my mom got sick, my mom, my sister, and I were all CEOs of organizations. We are all Lanas in our family. And I think when my mom got sick, it really brought into relief for us the fact that we were all strong in a way that was about independence. We loved each other a lot, but we had never really needed to depend on each other. And so one of the things I was exploring in this book, and particularly with Beth, the mom character, who defines her strength by caring for others and interdependence, that is something I've always admired in others, especially my friends who are parents and nurses and doctors. But I never really understood it. And I think that a lot of Lana's judgment of her daughter is a reflection of my internalized judgment of myself as I was shifting from being a CEO to caregiving. And so I think what I wanted to explore was, how do we get a group of women who all are independent to not just be open to, but really move towards uh, understanding, imagining, and maybe even loving the value of interdependence, which is something that was happening in my mom's house while I was writing this book.
Yeah. Yeah. I've read a lot in middle grade and YA fiction, and even in middle grade fiction that I've written, where there's a group of protagonists. You see this a lot
Mm-hmm.
with books about kids. And I always felt like it's really important that when you have a group like that, each of them has not only a distinct personality, but each of them brings something to the table. Each of them is going to
Mm-hmm.
contribute to solving the problem. Without the whole group, there would not be success. And I think that
Right.
this book is a really good example of that. But not with kids. I mean, one of Jack is a kid,
Sure.
but I
Sure.
think you see that less often with novels that are about
Mm.
grown-ups, than you do with novels that are where you have a group of kids as the protagonist.
Yeah, and
So
even I
I really
reflect
enjoyed
that,
that.
as I was editing the book, and one of the things my editor really pushed was that the initial draft was almost entirely from Lana's point of view,
Hmm.
and the Beth and Jack were really secondary. And she really encouraged me in terms of saying, hey, if this is really going to be about all three of these women, they maybe don't need equal time on the page, but they all need very active protagonism. We need to get into all of their heads. We need to see these relationships from each of their perspective. And actually, without giving anything away, a spoiler, the very final conflict in the book, the high stakes confrontation that happens at the end is something I entirely rewrote because
Mm.
in the initial version, um, Lana, the grandmother, who is the star of the book, even if she, is alongside her daughter and granddaughter, in the original version, Lana did it all. And I
Yeah.
realized as I was working through it, to achieve what you're talking about, not only everybody needed to bring something to the table, but when the stakes are highest, everybody needs to be fully
Yeah.
showing up because otherwise, this idea about interdependence is not legitimate. Because if the, top dog can do it all by themselves, why did they need the other people? And I do, it's funny, Charlie, I love reading and have been playing with writing a heist novel. And one of the things I think
Yeah.
is so interesting about heist stories is they are always crew stories.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
is you need a lot of people actually to pull off a big heist. And it's one of the things that fascinates me about watching heist movies is it's a version of an adult story where there really is that kind of team up,
Yeah.
different contributions situation.
Yeah. And there's this moment for the reader too that I find, for me, it was a very enjoyable moment when you can see from the page count that we're getting near the end of the book, and you realize, oh, all three of them are going to be in the same place in this next scene. This is going
Mm,
to get good because they're all,
mm-hmm.
if they're all there, then they all need to be there, and
Right,
I
right.
think that's a great moment for the reader to encounter. Um, so you open this novel, you said you have a prologue, then you've got a couple chapters, and then it says 17 weeks later,
Mm,
which kind of like threw me for a second. I was like, oh, wow, because we were really much in real time. And then it was,
yeah.
how do you decide what you're going to put in and what you're going to leave out? Because most of the 17 weeks is the beginning of cancer treatment and the grandmother moving up to Beth's house and all that stuff. But in a more broad sense, how do you decide what things it's okay to leave out?
Yeah, well, I will say that in earlier drafts, I had a lot of that in, and I learned I
Yeah.
could pull it out. But I think that in the first draft, it's hard to know, and I think that when I'm a big believer that your first draft, you should just be trying to keep your momentum going, and you'll figure out later where it drags. And I think that again with this book, I was so sensitive about the pacing question because especially genre readers of mystery really expect a certain level of a driving pace, and I think that you know. Because we are also doing this family story, you could feel like it was slow in that case. So I was always looking for where can we move forward, and also sometimes one good piece of advice I once heard about multi-point of view books was they said, if you're trying to figure out whose head should you be in any given chapter, it should be whoever is under the most pressure or whomever the stakes are biggest for in that situation at that moment. And I think similarly when it comes to what to put in and what to leave out, Walter Mosley, right, famously said, I leave out all the boring parts. So I think that looking for what are the parts that are going to energize people forward. And as it turned out in my case, actually, the first draft not the first draft I wrote, but the first draft I submitted to agents was about 30,000 words lighter than the final draft in the book. So in my experience, my agent and editor were not saying cut, cut, cut. They were saying add, add, add. And I think that people have different uh, initial intuitive approaches in terms of whether you're sparse or whether you're heavy. But I think it's also been very hard to figure it out for yourself. I also am a big fan of working with beta readers and always ask people, where did you put it down? Where did it drag? Was there anywhere where you wanted more of that character, more of that scene? Because I feel like again it's hard for me to judge that. I think also specific to this book, there's this funny problem of when you get sick, that the part where her life is getting worse because she's losing all the things in her life, her hair, her work, and she's feeling incredibly sick and stuck in bed. Stuck in bed is not a formula for active protagonism.
Yeah.
And so I knew it had to be there because there was some debate in my mind of should it start when she's already been living there and she just is starting to perk up a little bit? But it was like, no, you had to see her before. So, there's that figuring out of where's the right place to start kind of element, but then figuring out, okay, how do we zip through the things that need to be there, but are byways to the driving action that we're really going to get back into? Because as you know, yes, it starts in real time, and then after that leap, it's in real time
Yeah.
over, I think, about a 9-day span, the rest of the book. So it's coming back tight, but I needed that jump.
And I think, the fact that Lana is, in the midst of cancer treatment, and we all know the ways in which that weakens you. To me, it adds this element of stress to almost every scene she's in. I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
in my novel, The Enigma Affair, the main characters are both suffering from PTSD, and it means anytime you
Mm.
put them in a stressful situation, there's the reader's like, uh-oh. And I
Yeah.
felt the same way. I thought that really um it just added this tension to every time she
Mm.
went out, especially alone, that it
Yes.
had me flipping pages, because it's something that would be ordinary for one character walking up a hill to some apple trees is
Right.
a big deal if you're in the middle
Right.
of chemotherapy.
Yes, right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I also wanted to play with, which is something, my mom and I have experienced. I was just doing an event with my mom 2 days ago in Los Angeles. And whenever I go to Los Angeles to do a book event, it's so great to have her there. And everybody is asking her, how are you doing? And the reality is, she still has cancer. She's not cancer free, but she lives a very full life. And we always talk about this weirdness of when you're no longer on death's door, but you still on paper have a terminal condition.
Yeah.
How do you how does that impact your life? And I think that even in writing it, I was very influenced by the extent to which my own, mom, she has days where she seems totally quote unquote normal, and then she has bad days. And but you're right, it is always there, and there is an insecurity it adds to the situation. And obviously, it's funny because I think of so many detective stories where the detective has some kind of alcoholism is a classic one, right? But
Yeah.
or PTSD, some kind of thing that does often come up for them. And I think I'm just realizing now as you're bringing this up, I think that it does because a sleuth is often somebody who is putting things together quickly, is smarter than the reader to some extent, this kind of thing. It's nice to give them a balancer that can put them in danger so you don't feel like, oh, they've just got this done no matter what happens.
So we've talked a lot about Lana. We've talked about Beth. Let's focus on Jack for a minute because I
Yeah.
just like Jack's the one I want to hang out with. Jack is
Mm,
but talk about your motivation for well, tell us a little bit about her, but also your motivation for making her so independent at the beginning
yeah.
of the book. I mean, she's a 15-year-old who has her own job, who has her own savings account, who has the run of this huge natural area.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really wrote Jack to be the kind of young woman that I hope my daughter is growing up to be. My daughter's 10 right now. She was about 7.5 when I really was working on the book. And my daughter, we live out in the woods. She is a wild nature child. She gets on her own bike and bikes 2 miles to fifth grade every day. And so I think that, there is this extent to which I love living in nature and I love and I'm a big advocate for kids to be able to fully explore on their own. And so I wanted a character who had that confidence and that capability available to her. The other thing, though, I really worked with in developing Jack, especially since I had a 7-year-old, there's a danger, and I'm sure you know this if you're writing for young people. There's a danger that you might write a character who on the page it says they're 15, but really the way they're showing up looks like they're 7 or looks like they're 30. And I
Mm-hmm.
think
Yeah,
that one of the things I was really mindful about was what does it mean to be 15 and to be in an age where you do have more independence and more of the world available to you and you want more and more of the world, but sometimes that overwhelms you
yeah.
and you end up snuggling with your mom again. And actually, my best friend is a high school sex ed and health teacher, and she really helped me in thinking about some of the developmental elements of where Jack would be at, both around her own independence and her mom and her grandma, but also around the fact of being biracial in this space and being, in a single mom family. And so that was also really helpful in starting to or continuing to develop that character.
And I love the way Jack sort of becomes the bridge between Beth and Lana too, that she's able to see her grandmother in a different light from the light that her mother sees her in, because she wasn't, the neglected child and everything else.
Absolutely. And also for Beth and Lana, while they may not see eye to eye on much with respect to their own relationship, they both want to protect Jack. And
Yeah.
so I think that Jack is a source, she is a huge driver of Lana and Beth coming together, both in the mystery and wanting to protect her, but also, frankly, Lana and Beth get a little competitive about their relationship with Jack. And that helps too, seeing each other love this child creates a bond, but also continues some tension as well.
Yeah, yeah. Now, as you said, these are three strong women who are strong in different ways.
Mhm.
And Lana says something that well, she says a lot of things that I just love, but at one point she does make me laugh out loud sometimes. And
Good.
she's talking, I think she's talking to Jack in the situation, but she says it's always good to give men simple instructions in complicated situations. Talk a little bit about the contrast between the female characters and the male characters in this book
Yeah.
without giving too much away.
Sure. Well, and Charlie, that is the most highlighted line on the Kindle edition of the book, and I love that line. Yeah, I mean, I think that Um, I wrote this book originally to be a source of comfort and joy for me and my mom.
Yeah.
And I think that we grew up in a very woman-centered and women-powered household. And so I really was interested in writing a book that allowed me to fully indulge around that. So, yes, in general, in this book, the women are strong and the men have deficiencies. But I mean, there are kind women and there are evil women and there are kind men and there are bad men in the book. But so it's not like men bad, women good, but I did want to really play with what does it look like to have a female gaze led book, in terms of where the protagonism is, where the humor is, and that the men kind of become, yes, the butt of the joke a little more than the women, and the women really are in control. One of the things I loved about writing Lana, this is a way I'm really not a Lana, is I'm more like Beth or Jack, a very crunchy outdoor person. Lana is always in her Chanel suits and her 4-inch heels, and she is just running circles around the men in this book. And I've had readers reach out to me and say, "Oh my gosh, the way Lana has her first connection with Paul, who owns the kayak shack, is my goals for how I want, to like treat men and be treated by men." And I'm like, okay, that's fascinating. But I do think that it was fun to write a manipulator. And also I read somewhere that one of the hard things about writing amateur sleuths is that they're not the cops, right? So they don't have access to crime scenes and to autopsies and things. So an amateur sleuth needs a special power. I mean, you think about Sherlock Holmes, obviously has this incredible power of deduction. There are people like Jack Reacher, whose power is his ability to beat people up. And I decided Lana's power was going to be the power to manipulate men. And it's not a power I feel that I have or even have much experience with, but I had a lot of fun writing it, and I think a lot of the um, humor and energy and sass in the book comes from some of these dynamics. Now, also, there are ways that it gets more serious. There's a detective team of an older white man, Nicoletti, and a younger Latina woman, Detective Ramirez. And there's a lot more overt misogyny and discrimination happening there than in some of the other relationships. But Ramirez was another strong woman I wanted to write, who again kind of is coming from a very different identity and a different background. And so the way she shows up with power has to be different than the other women as well.
Yeah. Now you mentioned something about you used the word fun and you used the word humor, and I want to,
Yeah.
you know, again, I bet you a lot of people highlighted this line too. Lana says that Beth's house, quote, looked like Martha Stewart had been trapped on a desert island for a very long time.
Yes.
Can you talk about this is a book about murder and cancer and family dysfunctionality, but can you talk about the role of humor in this novel?
Yeah. Well, again, it comes from the fact that I was writing it to be joyful. And I think that one of and there are, I, I okay, I don't think I've ever talked about this, but one of the reasons I started writing this book, or one of the things that made me feel like maybe I could, was that right when my mom got sick, we started this website called a Caring Bridge. Caring Bridge is
Yeah.
this platform. It's a free online platform that is like a social platform used only for one thing, which is to let people know about a sick person and how they're doing. And you can organize meal trains and things like that. And so I was responsible, and I chose to take the responsibility to write these messages to all the people in my mom's life about what was going on with her. And my mom has an incredible community of tough, funny, mostly Jewish, mostly divorced women who are her close friends and have been friends with her in some cases for 50 years. And when she was sick and we were so scared and things were so bad, I was writing these things about these very complicated cancer situations. And I just really remember writing these and thinking, how can I write it so that Mimi and Lori and all these women can A, understand what's happening with my mom, but B, can feel some of the love and not be even more freaked out by this. And
Yeah.
so, for example, I remember writing about how I was, and we're learning all this stuff for the first time and talking about how immunotherapy is, how it works, and that, I said immunotherapy basically like lights up the cancer cells so that your own T cells and your own immunity, is able to target them. And I wrote something about how it was like having a bunch of firefighters take off their shirts, so that the cells could know where to go. Because I knew that for this community of women in their 60s and 70s, like this was going to be a metaphor that helped people understand what was happening, and b, bringing some lightness into this
Yeah.
terror. And so people say comedy is tragedy plus time, and so I think that there was this element of bringing humor, particularly into the cancer elements, and the family elements. And I think that Charlie, all my friends and people said to me, "Oh, you'll never regret spending this time with your mom." And they were absolutely right. But that time is not always fun or easy. There are not a lot of things to laugh about, and there's a lot of hard times. And so I wanted to bring joy into what I was writing. And then to what you're saying, also, I was very careful to kind of think about where does humor not belong?
Yeah.
So actually, interestingly, that line about Jack's grandma had always told her it was good to give men simple instructions in complicated situations. It comes right at the end of a very dramatic scene where a dead body is found.
Yeah.
And there's no humor in the dead body finding part. It's quite scary. But then you get there pretty quickly a couple pages later. And so I think I did have some ideas about there's some places where humor just doesn't belong, and there are some places where we can go further. There's also a lot of physical humor in the book that relates to the cancer element and just sort of, wigs and just some of the deficiencies. And I just had a lot of fun with that. One of my absolute favorite writers these days is Mick Herron, who writes the Slough House series that became the Apple TV show Slow Horses. And
Mhm.
I think he's just a master of writing taut spy thriller action and then a ton of humor in there as well, and it can all play together. So I was inspired by that. I was inspired by Jessie Q Sutanto and her amazing book Dial A for Aunties, which is kind of this zany Weekend at Bernie's meets a rom-com murder mystery, and just seeing how authors were making me laugh out loud when I was looking for comfort. I wanted to try and do that for other people as well.
Yeah. One thing I find in telling stories and in writing mysteries in particular is that there's a lot of the craft of it that for me has just become internalized because I've read a million books and I've
Mm-hmm.
told stories to a million small children and so on and so forth. And so then I try to step back and go, okay, what are the rules here? What's the adage? Your book made me, maybe somebody has said this before, probably, but it made me invent an adage about writing mysteries, which is when everything seems to be going just right, that's when everything's going to go horribly wrong. Uh, but can you talk about that? Because I think that's a great technique to sort of get to a point where it seems like, okay, it's all good. This is really good, and then bam, the
Absolutely.
exact thing you thought was good turns out to be
Yeah.
bad news. Yeah,
Well, and it's interesting because like you, I was really inspired and learned a lot from what I had read, but I had never written fiction before, let alone a murder mystery. And so what I really found was that in the beginning, it was like the first time you drive a car where you've been riding in cars for a long time, but then suddenly you're behind the wheel and
yeah,
everything seems disorienting. And actually, I got a great piece of advice from my agent that enabled me to do what you're talking about. Because in the first draft, Lana and Beth and Jack she said, look, you did a great job having a few credible suspects. There's multiple credible suspects here, and you line them all up. She said, but then the sleuths are just going to kind of visit suspects when it occurs to them. And she said, I want you to think about the idea of putting your suspects on a lazy Susan. And every new clue that is found should make the person who they've been investigating seem less suspicious and should send them racing to go see the next person.
yeah,
And so I think that element, whether it's about, as you're saying, upending expectations and turning, continuing to up the tension, up the stakes, up the conflict, or whether it's about doing this kind of lazy Susan go round of, wait, we thought it was this. Well, maybe it's this. All of that keeps people turning pages and keeps people engaged. And, I really notice now when I'm reading and when I'm writing as well, I notice, I think that there's a funny dichotomy. I'm curious how you see it between living in the fictive dream and really inviting people into the world of the story with the need and desire to keep waking people up with surprises. And it's like the surprises can't be so big that they take you out of the dream.
yeah,
But if you just keep going through the dream as anticipated, you fall asleep. And I find that sometimes, certainly in my first drafts, I play things out too long or too obvious. And I have to go back and say, wait, right there where they made the decision to do X, that's the first idea I had. What are three other things that could happen there instead? So it's still plausible, but it's not the first thing you think of. And definitely when I'm reviewing early drafts and manuscripts for other people, it's something I sometimes notice is, oh, this book is playing out exactly the way I imagine that it would, and that is boring me.
yeah,
And I want there to be those surprises. I want the stakes to raise, even if I know that that's formulaic for the stakes to raise in this way. I want you to do it in some interesting ways. Yeah.
yeah. And I like, there are a lot of places in this book where somebody finds out something and I go, okay, I know that's a clue. It's so obvious to me. That's an important clue, but I have no idea how it fits into anything or what it means. There's a certain photograph that I felt that way about at the beginning.
Mm,
It's quite clearly a clue, but like, I don't know what it means. And I think
yeah.
that's a great way to do that. Just real quickly, we've talked about the male, the female, the professional, the non-professional characters in this novel, but we've only talked about human beings. And it seems to me
Mm,
like there's one other main character in this novel, and that is the natural world. Can you talk a little bit
hmm.
about how that fits into this narrative?
Yeah, so this book takes place in Elkhorn Slough, which is this incredible marine preserve. It's one of the top 10 wildlife viewing places in the country. And if you want to see otters on demand, come to Elkhorn Slough. They are always there. There are sea lions, there are jellyfish, there's incredible birds. And the water itself feels alive because it's a wetland right next to the Pacific Ocean. So the tidal inflow and outflow throughout the day is really tremendous in how it just reshapes the land. I wanted to set the book there because I feel, well, I love nature. I live out in nature. I actually live in the woods. I don't live in the wetlands, but I live close enough to Elkhorn Slough. I could visit it often. I feel like it's a very interesting place because for a mystery, because it exists on the edge of multiple worlds. There is the wildness and the conservation of the wetland and the nature preserve, but there's also a power plant and a marina and working farms and a highway that runs right through it. And I feel like any place where there are multiple different worlds and interests butting up against each other is ripe for conflict and therefore ripe for murder. And then the other thing I'll just note, though, is because I'm such a nature nerd, the first draft of the book had almost none of the nature writing that is in the book now. It had some of Lana's perspective that, not only was Beth's house looked like, Martha Stewart had been stuck on an island for a very long time, but that the slough itself was muddy, stinky, and gross.
Yeah.
And I wrote mostly from Lana's perspective about the land and about nature in general because I was nervous that as a first-time author, I was going to get too preachy and too in my own wheelhouse of something I loved. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to write from the perspective of a character who has a totally different perspective on this than I do. And then it was only when my agent and my editor got involved where they said, okay, we get it that it's gross, but can you add in a little more of the beauty? Anywhere I had just a glimpse of beauty, they're like, more of this, more of this,
Yeah.
more of this. And so it felt funny that something I had avoided because I was afraid I would be overindulging myself turned out to be something that was really wanted and I feel like is a real asset to the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we like to end every episode of Inside the Writer's Studio with the same 10 questions. You should be able to answer each in just a few words, but hopefully they'll give us some insight into you and into your writing. So to begin, what word do you love to work into your writing?
Huh. Um, I don't know. I care a lot about word choice. I was a poet, a million years ago, and maybe a word I haven't worked in, but that the word that immediately comes to mind when you said that, even though it's not in this book, is igloo. And the only reason I say that is when I was a slam poet, which is, verbal performed poetry, I went on tour. I was an engineering student by day and a poet by night, and I went on tour with this guy who was obsessive about his performance. And I remember a 4-hour drive down the East Coast where he spent the entire time experimenting with different ways to say the word igloo and trying to find the funniest way to pronounce it. And I do feel like lines like the line about, giving men simple instructions in complicated situations or Martha Stewart on a desert island. I spend a lot of time not just thinking about the image, but thinking about what are the exact words that are going to make this joke or this image land. And I had a friend who was reading the book who texted me the other day. Let's see if I can find this. Um, he said, "Hey, I really like your book, especially your use of uncommon but not $10 words." And I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah.
that was a great description of I have a wide vocabulary, but I don't want to come off like an asshole.
Right. Yeah. What word do you hate to encounter in other people's writing?
Anything equivocal,
Yeah.
actually, I think that and then I can. I enjoy some fancy words. I like a literary book that's a challenge with a dictionary. But when I'm reading commercial fiction, I don't want people to screw around in that way.
Yeah. Where's your favorite place to write?
Oh, in my kitchen where I am right now. I live off the grid in the Redwood Mountains, and we have a very small, a 300 square foot cabin that we live in. And then we have this kitchen building that I'm sitting in that's about 120 square feet. And it's just surrounded by, windows and
Uh,
trees. And you can't, there's no distractions here. It's always warm because of the propane stove. So I love writing in my kitchen.
where could you never write?
I've gotten more and more open to writing in different places. I don't love to write in a coffee shop, but I can, and I play a lot of beach volleyball, and I've even done I guess I've done a lot of editing on the beach. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that I can't write with human distractions, people talking to me. I don't listen to music that has words when I write. So I prefer to be on my own and somewhat in nature. But I've had good experiences writing in bars, writing in different places.
To what rule of grammar do you pay least attention?
Oh, sentence fragments. My daughter was in third grade when I was working on the copy edits, and she had just learned about commas and periods and what makes a full sentence. And she would just sit there next to me. I had this paper draft, and she would just take the red pen. Mom, that's not a sentence. Mom, that's not a sentence. Mom, that's not a sentence. So I feel like I'm putting the period wherever I want to put it.
What was the first book you remember reading?
The first book I remember loving is Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, which is a sci-fi novel. But I mean, I was a huge reader before then, and that was middle school probably when I read that. But I just kind of churned through books. I was one of those kids who was always taking a huge stack from the library. And at one point, actually, at the Studio City Branch Library, which was our local branch, I decided I was going to start with the nonfiction at the zero zero zeros and work my way through. But the zero zero zeros are like Greek philosophy. And so I was like in fourth grade getting
Oh,
these
no.
huge books of Plato and Aristotle, and I did not make it very far in my ambition.
What are you reading now?
Oh, I am reading a bunch of different books. I am reading a great nonfiction book about these two female botanists who, in the 30s, were the first women to successfully complete a Grand Canyon run and mapped the plants of the canyon. It's called Brave the Wild River. And that's a book by Melissa Savigny. I have been inhaling books by Ashley Winstead. I am so impressed by how she hops genres. And I just finished 7 Days in June by Tia Williams, which is just about the smartest, sexiest romance novel. I never read romance before the pandemic, and in my quest for comfort, found myself really enjoying rom-coms. And 7 Days in June is the rare romance novel that has huge heft to it and is also a very sexy book.
What book would you like to have written?
Mystic River by Dennis Lehane. I think that nobody does interiority like him, in my opinion. And I think that the way he gets deep into characters, the way he makes you, I don't even know if I can use the term root for, but feel deep empathy for people is just incredible. And yeah, I just think he's amazing in that regard.
What sort of book would you like to write, but probably never will?
Oh, I mean, maybe a rom-com. I definitely feel like I had a lot of fun in Mother Daughter Murder Night with the dialogue side and kind of the
Yeah.
punchiness. And I do feel like I learned a lot from rom-coms about that. But I don't feel like I understand that genre deeply enough to feel like that's right for me. Um, there are a lot of books I am now hoping to write, and
Yeah.
I'm working, to also figure out what's the path for my career. Because this book, as we've talked about, came out of such an idiosyncratic
Mhm.
situation. And so now, as I have the incredible privilege and opportunity to write more novels, I find that the things I'm interested in, they bear some resemblance to Mother Daughter Murder Night in terms of I'm interested in strong women and I'm interested in crime. But I'm interested in strong women committing crimes. I'm interested in strong women, who are doing some of the you know, fierce, outdoorsy, dirty work that I love. And so I think that I'm trying to learn how to navigate, um, the path of the passions I have and the stories I want to tell, and how that lines up with, what people who love Mother Daughter Murder Night might be hoping to read from me in the future.
And finally, what would you like to hear a reader tell you?
Oh, I've been so blessed to hear this from many people. There's a line in the very end of the acknowledgments, um, where I say, uh, well, this is the last paragraph of the acknowledgments. Finally, I'd like to thank you for reading this book. I wrote it to carve out a den of creative comfort for me and my mother. The idea that it might also bring some pleasure to you is beyond my wildest dreams. Wherever you are, whatever you're dealing with, I hope this story reaches out and gives you a fierce little hug in the wilderness. I'm rooting for you and for love. And sometimes I get these emails from people who say that they needed that hug, or they share with me what's going on with their own challenges or their family challenges or their experience with cancer. And it just feels like an enormous privilege when people are able to be vulnerable and to share that with me, and that they find some comfort in such a hard time. And so I feel like I did not write this book trying to write the great American novel. I wrote this book to be a source of comfort and joy. And so when people tell me that it's that for them, I just feel so grateful.
This has been Inside the Writer's Studio. I'm your host, Charlie Lovett, and my guest today has been Nina Simon, whose novel Mother Daughter Murder Night is available wherever books are sold. Nina, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Charlie.
Inside the Writer's Studio is sponsored by Bookmarks, a literary nonprofit that runs the largest annual book festival in the Carolinas and operates a community gathering place and nonprofit independent bookstore in downtown Winston-Salem, North Carolina. To find out more about Bookmarks and all its programs, visit www.bookmarksnc.org. Inside the Writer's Studio is proud to be affiliated with Libro FM. Unlike other audiobook platforms, Libro FM supports your local independent bookstore. Whether you buy a single book or, like me, a monthly subscription, you can link your account to your local store or to Bookmarks to support literary community. For a special 2-for-1 offer, go to Libro.fm and use the discount code WRITERS. If you've enjoyed Inside the Writer's Studio, please consider leaving a rating or review online at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Inside the Writer's Studio posts new episodes on the 1st and 15th of every month. As I post this episode, I'm headed to the final dress rehearsal of the stage adaptation of my novel, Escaping Dreamland. So I've been pretty busy at the theater lately. Who I'm going to interview on my next show, I'm not sure about. But whoever it is, I hope you'll join us. And until then, may you read with wonder and write with passion.